Let's do a little Hardy Boys action. This one is Hardy Boys number 20. It's called Mystery of the Flying Express. And it was first written in 1941, but it's been updated in 1977. We'll see how they updated it. Chapter 1, Stargazer. Loud explosions like a fusillade of gunfire echoed through the quiet streets of Bayport. We know the Hardy Boys live in Bayport, don't we? An old jalopy careened around the corner. The driver of the car, plump and freckle-faced, pulled up before the home of Fenton Hardy, private detective. Frank Hardy, 18 years old, and his brother Joe, a year younger. Do your math. How young was that? He'd be 17. Guessed who was coming before they spotted the visitor. Chet Morton for sure, said blonde-haired Joe, looking out a window. And is he excited? Chet waved and beckoned. Hey, fellas, big doings at the waterfront. Let's go, he called out as the Hardy Boys bounded down the front steps. What's it all about? Asked the dark-haired Frank. Hop in, and I'll explain on the way. The three crowded into the front seat of Chet's car. Chet started it up, and it lurched away from the curb, jouncing its passengers as it picked up speed and headed for Bayport Harbor. Joe braced himself with a hand against the dashboard. Okay, we're on our way. You'd better clue us in before this ancient heap decides to pause for a rest. Chet laughed. Sir, you are referring to the vehicle I love. But I'll overlook that remark in view of the circumstances. Seriously, though, there's real trouble down there. Something to do with the big hydrofoil. Joe looked surprised. The Flying Express? That hydrofoil? I thought she was all set for her maiden spin the day after tomorrow. Well, the hydrofoil is a kind of a boat that goes above the water on skis, and it's that boat that's on the cover of the book. You can see the skis down in the water. Chet shifted gears as he turned into Bayport's main street. Right, the Flying Express is scheduled to begin her new commuter service to Providence. Wish I had a ticket, but they're all sold out. Providence was a port at the tip of Cape Cutlass, 70 miles south of Bayport, down the ocean. The three kids often spun down there and back aboard the Hardy's motorboat, the Sleuth. Let me try that. The three kids often spun down there and back aboard the Hardy's motorboat called the Sleuth, which is another word for detective. What's wrong with the Flying Express? Frank wanted to know. Is it mechanical failure? Not the way I understand it, Chet replied. Something to do with public relations. Seems like quite a few people would like to foil the hydrofoil. Ha ha ha. That means do some monkey business on it. Ow, Joe said. Pretty corny pun. Chet stopped at a red light near Condor's photo store. Hey, Frank, let's pick up the passport pictures while we're here, Joe suggested. Good idea, Chet. Pull over for a minute, will you? Fenton Hardy and his colleague, Sam Radley, had their photos taken to renew their passports, which they always kept up to date. Chet parked in front of the shop, and the Hardy Boys hastened inside. Frank took Sam's pictures, while Joe pocketed his father's. They picked up the photographer and soon were off again. They paid the photographer and were soon off again for the waterfront. As they approached the dock where the Flying Express was tied up, they could hear all the noise of the crowd gathered there. Small boat owners milled around. They were not small owners, they owned small boats. Milled around, shouting and gesturing at the shiny white fiberglass vessel riding low in the water. Must have been some sight. Chet parked the car nearby and they all got out. The ship's sleek hull had enclosed cabins forward and aft, and a really nifty pilot's bridge on top. The windshield of the wheelhouse looked out over the metal deck. This forward deck obviously was not for passengers. The back deck was slightly lower and guarded by a white pipe railing. Quite a boat, Frank said. She's 100 feet long and has accommodations for 60 passengers, Chet explained, and a top speed of 70 miles an hour on the water. I wonder what they have against a beauty like that, Joe said, pointing toward a picket line carrying signs. In bold lettering, one sign read, "Stop the Flying Express. Make Barmet Bay safe." "Beats me," Frank replied. "I can't see how it'll get in anybody's way as long as it slows down when she enters the harbor. Barmet Bay is big enough for everybody." Chet had been inspecting the rest of the crowd. "Those kids near the slip are painting signs. I think I'll mosey over for a closer look at their artistic productions. Hey, what's this?" One of the sign painters suddenly pushed a placard into his hand. Frank and Joe received the same treatment from a couple of paint-smeared teenagers. Before they realized it, the Hardys and Chet were holding slogans of protest against the hydrofoil. "Hey, we've got nothing to do with you guys," Chet shouted angrily. "Watch out," Joe warned. "Here comes a TV news truck. Let's get out of here." Hurriedly, the boys threw down the placards, but it was too late. The truck had swept past, its lens pointed directly at them. "Holy catfish, they've got us on TV," Joe groaned. Some of the pickets were yelling for a raid on the Flying Express. "Scuttle the hydrofoil," one of them shouted. The rest took up the chant, "Scuttle the hydrofoil, scuttle the hydrofoil." Wow, sounds like some civil unrest. They were about to go into action when a police car rolled into the middle of the mob. Bayport's chief of police got out and surveyed the disorder. "We got a complaint about this dock being blocked illegally," Chief Collig boomed through a bullhorn. "I want some explanations. Let's start with you two fellas." "Well, if it isn't Frank and Joe Hardy, how'd you get involved?" Chief Collig knew the Hardy boys well because they frequently helped their father with his detective cases, and he's been in some of the other books that I've read from the Hardy boys, if you recall. The Hardy boys' ability as amateur detectives was known to just about everybody in Bayport, and they cooperated with the police whenever they could. While Frank spoke to the chief, Chet slipped away to a group of sign painters and began working with a brush and a piece of cardboard. "Some pal, leaving us to face the music," Joe thought. "We're not in this fracas, Chief," Frank said. "We're the most innocent bystanders you ever saw." A middle-aged woman rushed forward, brandishing a finger at the Hardys. "Innocent, my foot! I saw them! They were right in the middle of it!" Chet, carrying a sign behind his back, edged his way into the group around Frank and Joe. The woman was running out of breath. She finished by pointing to a placard on the ground and declared triumphantly, "There, that's one of the signs they were carrying. Look for yourself." "I'll get it," Chet said quickly. Stooping over, he deftly switched placards and straightened up with the one he had been carried. He pushed it into Frank's hands and raised the boy's elbow so that everybody could read the words he had painted. And it said, "Frank Hardy for mayor." A roar of laughter came from the crowd. Even Chief Collig showed the trace of a smile. Frank glanced at the sign and winked at Chet. By now, the ugly mood of the protesters was evaporating. They began to drift away from the dock. Seeing that everything was under control, Chief Collig drove back to town to headquarters. Frank, Joe, and Chet returned to the Hardys' home. They were met at the door by the boys' Aunt Gertrude, Fenton Hardy's sister, who had come to live with the family some time ago. She was tall and had a no-nonsense look behind her spectacles. Although Aunt Gertrude scolded the boys for taking what she considered too many risks, she held her nephews in the deepest affection. She liked them. "I hear that there was some trouble at the waterfront," she said sternly. "No doubt you were there." "Of course we were, Auntie," Joe grinned, "but we spent most of our time with Chief Collig, on the right side of the law." Chet rolled his eyes at Aunt Gertrude. "How's the food situation today? You wouldn't happen to have any of our favorite pies in the house, would you?" Chet's always hungry. "Maybe I would, Chet. Come on into the kitchen." While she put big slices of rhubarb and strawberry pie on 3 plates, I love rhubarb and strawberry pie. Frank took milk from the refrigerator. Then the trio carried their refreshments into the living room. "You know," Chet said between mouthfuls, "I still don't know how a hydrofoil works." "Well," Frank explained, "at slow speeds, it floats on the water like a boat. When the pilot revs up the motor, the hull rises clear of the water and skims along like a low-flying airplane. Pretty neat invention. It was invented by Enrico Forlanini in 1906. That's over 115 years ago, which is actually older than I am. You mean it actually takes off? Chet asked. No, it doesn't leave contact with the water because it's standing on these struts attached to submerged skis or foils. They're shaped like wings to give a balancing effect. I think I get it. You see, Chet, Frank continued, as speed increases, the water flowing over the rounded top of those wings travels faster than the water underneath. That causes less pressure above and gives the hull the lift to get clear of the surface. It's the same principle as an airplane wing in the air. Chet downed his last piece of pie. Well, what about propulsion? Joe took up the explanation. Well, the U.S. Navy has done a great deal of experimenting using everything from gasoline to jet engines. The Flying Express happens to have a diesel motor. The motor turns the propellers and the stern. A hydrofoil provides a fast, smooth ride and it doesn't create much of a wake. Exactly, Frank pointed out. So why would the small boat owners object to a hydrofoil on Barmet Bay? It's not going to swamp them. Accidents will happen, but you can say that about anything that sails. Today's protest was strange, to say the least. Joe sighed. You said it. Anyhow, it's too bad we won't be on board for our first trip. We had planned to take Callie and Iola, but went for tickets too late. Callie Shaw was Frank's favorite date, and Joe enjoyed being with Chet's sister, Iola. Chet put his glass down with a clank. Jumping Gemini, I could have told you to save your time and energy. You and Callie are both Aries. Your horoscopes indicate that bad news is all you can expect right now, since you were born under the sign of the Ram. What? Frank and Joe exchanged knowing smiles. Chet was always involved in some new hobby. Just now it was astrology, casting horoscopes to discover the influence that the stars and the planets are supposed to have upon a person's life. So, you're reading Joe's fate in the stars? Frank laughed. Don't you laugh, Chet spoke with an owlish air of solemnity. You're a Scorpio, the sign of the scorpion. The planets aren't in the right conjunction for you this month either. Do you really believe all that? They said. Sure I do. What was good enough for the ancient Egyptians is good enough for me. Chet adopted the tone of a professor lecturing to rather dim-witted students. It was a pose he enjoyed. Listen carefully. A scorpion likes to think things out, taking into account all the factors of a problem. He's good at analyzing clues and motives. He's a born leader. That's you, Frank. Chet cleared his throat and went on. An Aryan is more of an activist. He dashes into all kinds of situations without worrying too much about consequences. He's full of enthusiasm and good humor. That's you, Joe. Makes sense, doesn't it? Well, the Hardy Boys agreed that it did. On many of their cases, Frank tended to be the leader because he could figure out the logical steps to take. Joe, on the other hand, was impetuous and refused to admit anything was impossible. Still, Frank wondered, there are times when I'm more impulsive and, hey, looks like we're getting some company, Joe interrupted his brother. The other two boys joined Joe at the window. A man stopped and looked at the Hardy house. He walked past, turned around, paused, squinted at the number again on the house, and then he came to the front door. Here comes more bad news, Chet worried. That's the end of the chapter, and that's where we're going to stop today. Next, chapter 2 is First Warning.